Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Principles Hour. Today is a day of lasts. This is the last week of semester. It's the last Principles Hour for the year. Today we're going to have our last sermon in our series from Genesis, where Sarah and then Abraham will take their last breaths. And today we have our last culture spot and our last COVID spot, which is going to be a really special fusion of the two, with Kirk and Rob leading us in that. Today is our last book week dress-up of the year. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but it's wonderful to see you all in amazing costumes. And also, today, for many of you, is going to be your last Principles Hour at SMBC, because this is your last semester of study here. And in a little while, Alan Mugridge is going to lead us in a special prayer for you. But before we go any further, I would like to say a few thank yous surrounding Principles Hour this semester. It's actually been a huge feat to get it going out in dual modes, live stream as well as in the classroom. I want to say a huge thank you to our tech team, our IT team over there, who've done an amazing job this semester. Greg and Graham's team have been doing setup and arranging COVID-safe morning tea has been huge. Also want to thank the music team for providing wonderful music that we've just been able to, if we're in the room, just been able to sit and listen and enjoy and engage in other ways this semester. And also the booking team led by Jane Robertson, so that you can book seats each week. So thank you to everyone who's made Principles Hour possible in the COVID era. It's been great. Well, we're going to begin this day of lasts by looking back and looking forward. We're going to look back on our semester at Principles Hour as we've walked the journey with Abraham and Sarah who've been learning to trust God as he makes promises to them. We're going to look back on that now and ask what God has been teaching us. We're going to look back on some of the events, the situations in harems, battles against kings, covenant-making ceremonies, circumcisions, the destruction of entire cities, the birth of sons. There's been the almost sacrifice of a much-loved son. We want to ask, what has God been saying to us? What has God been teaching us?
Bonjour, Kirk.
Bonjour. Hopefully this is working.
Tout va bien?
I'm not really...
Are you well?
I am well. Très bien, merci. Today, COVID spot meets culture spot as we look at the 1947 novel, The Plague.
La Peste.
By Albert Camus. Why did you read the book, Ron?
Well, I kept hearing people talking about it, and in fact a friend of mine put out some podcasts about the plague, and I heard of a conference in the UK about COVID and Camus, and I thought, wow, this is a book for the moment. Obviously, it's a book about a plague, and we're in the middle of a plague of sorts. And so I thought, yeah, well, that may be a book I ought to read. And I've read some of Camus before, and I find him a very compelling writer and insightful author. And I was struck, in fact, just the very sort of opening page of the book, where there's a little epigraph from Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. And it says this is Defoe: "It is as reasonable to represent one kind of imprisonment by another as it is to represent anything that really exists by that which exists not." And I thought, okay, I'm in. This is clearly fiction, but it's representing, or seeking to represent, important realities. So that, yeah. What about you, Kirk? What led you to read The Plague?
Well, as COVID began, I was noticing everything was exponential graphs and everything was, this is unprecedented. And I thought, is it really unprecedented? And what's the soul that stands behind the exponential graphs? So I wanted a story. So I started reading The Plague, and I met characters who were facing uncertainty, fear, loneliness, boredom, and having to make a choice between individual happiness and the common good. And I've found that really beneficial.
Yeah.
Now, Rob, can you give us some background to Camus and the book? What's he doing in this work?
Well, a little bit about Camus. Camus was a French-Algerian philosopher, novelist, journalist, writer. In fact, he got awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, just before he died, about 3 years before he died. Died at the age of only 47, tragically. He's often regarded as an existentialist thinker. He didn't like that term himself, but he's lumped in with Jean-Paul Sartre and various others in that sort of mould, mostly because he focuses on what he often called the absurdity of life, by which he didn't mean sort of life's stupidity or pointlessness, but rather he was talking about the collision between our innate desire for order and meaning and purpose with the world, with all its seeming indifference and silence and apparent lack of meaning. That clash that we experience, that was what he meant by the absurd. And so that is infused through all of his writings, including The Plague. Now, The Plague, interestingly, he started writing it in 1941 in Paris, after the Germans had occupied Paris. But then he got caught up in the French resistance for the rest of the war, and it took him a long time to finish. He didn't finish until 1947, as Kirk mentioned, so it took him a while to actually write the novel, but helpfully because it's infused with, a range of influences, one being his experience of living in France under German occupation. The novel's set in an Algerian town or city called Oran, and he grew up in Algeria, so it's full of his own reminiscences of life in that part of the world. But he tells us very clearly, yes, it's fiction, but based on lots of history. He researched over 30 historic plagues, and so all of that sort of insights embedded in the work. He was very clear, yes, it's infused with the experiences of living in Paris under the Germans, so you can sort of sense that sort of, being the lockdown under plague and the lockdown under occupation. You can see the parallels there. But above all, it's really a kind of parable, a reflection, perhaps better, on human existence. And not just the absurdity, but this came out of what people call his revolt phase. I think he himself called it that, which is how do we push back against that? How do we fight against the seeming purposelessness of the world? So that's a bit about Camus and a bit about the book. Now, I'm going to
ask you a question, Rob, in this very natural script. Hey, Rob, we were both struck by the importance of two sermons in the book by Father Panalou, a Jesuit priest.
We were.
Tell us about those sermons.
Yes. Father Panalou, Catholic priest. There are two recorded sermons in the book. The first one, if I can put it in a nutshell, is, this is judgment from God and you deserve it. Right? That's kind of the nutshell of the first sermon. The second sermon comes sometime later in the book, after a whole lot of things have happened to people, the town, and to the Father Panalou himself. And, to sum that sermon up, it more or less goes, what I said in my first sermon was true, but he says, I said it without charity. And I said it without acknowledging mystery. And so he brings those themes into the second sermon, that we stand under this together. So rather than him pronouncing down, we're in this together, and we've got to acknowledge that it doesn't make sense. We can't make sense of it, but we have no option but to trust God, says Panalou. At the end of that sermon, he says, my brethren, the moment has come, one must believe everything or deny everything. And then he says, who among you would dare to deny everything? In other words, trust God completely or don't trust him at all. So, they're the two sermons, very interesting. Now, my question for you, Kirk, just off the top of my head, is if you were preaching in such a moment, and perhaps you have this year, what would you want to add to Father Panalou's thoughts and messages?
As I've been looking at them, I've been struck by how nuanced they are, so I'd encourage you to get a copy of the book and read them. But I wish they were more biblical. They're really historical and sort of philosophical sermons. I wish there was less certainty than saying things like, calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it. I wish there was more lament and empathy, more attentiveness to what nurtures people. And in the second sermon, I mean, there is the kind of the mystery there and the surrender to God. But it ends with a comment that where Panalu's thought is going is that it's illogical for a priest to call a doctor. And that becomes important in the plot. It's illogical for a priest to call a doctor. And there's a kind of a dualism there that I wish wasn't part of the sermon. Yeah.
And no Jesus, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to read an extract that's been significant for you?
Funny you should ask. Here's one I prepared earlier. There are so many, when we thought, can we read extracts? I thought, oh gosh, there's so many nuggets and profound segments. But yes, here's one. The main character, there's a protagonist who turns out to be the narrator, is a guy named Dr. Rieu. And so he's basically, you're following him around as he's diagnosing people and curing some and burying most. But here's a little section reflecting on Dr. Rieu. It says, his sensibility was getting out of hand. Held back most of the time, hardened and dried out, it would occasionally collapse and abandon him to feelings that he could no longer control. His only defence was to resort to hardening himself and tightening the knot which had formed in him. He knew full well that this was the correct way to proceed. For the rest, he had few illusions, and tiredness took away even those he still had. He knew that for a period of time, the end of which he could not foresee, his role was no longer that of a healer, it was that of a diagnostician, discovering, seeing, describing, noting, and then condemning. That was his task. Wives would seize him by the wrist and scream, "Doctor, give him life." But he was not there to give life. He was there to order isolation. What use then was there? What use then was the hatred that he could read on people's faces? You have no heart, someone once told him, but he did have one. He used it to bear the 20 hours a day in which he saw men dying who were made for life. He used it to start again day after day. For the time being, he had just enough heart for that. How could his heart have been big enough to give life? That's Dr. Rieu. What about you, Kirk?
Well, Dr. Rieu, at the end, he was already halfway up the stairs. Cold, fathomless depths of sky glimmered overhead, and near the hilltops stars shone, hard as flint. That's a really interesting image of the universe in which Rieu lives. Cold, fathomless depths of sky. So, as I read the book, I was really drawn to Rieu more than to the Jesuit priest in the book. And that disturbed me a bit. Rieu had a kind of a decency, a concern for the common good that's very attractive in the book. And I thought, I want to be a bit like him. I like wisdom. I like looking at creation and learning from creation. I like learning from human disciplines like a doctor might. But I don't want to live in a world of a cold, fathomless sky. And I fear sometimes that in me there's a practical atheism, that my faith is logical and prayerless, and in a sense, faithless. And I don't want to live like that in COVID times. For you, an impact?
Yeah, well, like you, I'm impressed by Rieu, but also chilled by him, because in the end he's got nothing. Part of his message, as the book says, is that he says, all I can say is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and as far as possible, one must refuse to be on the side of the pestilence. Like, that's kind of it. That's all you got. You've just got to fight, even though you can't win. And the way the book ends is quite chilling in that respect, isn't it? It says, the doctor knew what most people don't, which is that the plague never actually goes away. It's lurking there, waiting to emerge. And so you just got to keep fighting, can't surrender, but you can't win. And so there is a hopelessness to it, even though it tries to give a message of hope. And interestingly, that was what Camus was trying to find throughout his life. And towards the very end of his life, he began meeting up with a Methodist pastor. the Methodist pastorate has since written about those conversations and reported that Camus asked to be privately baptised not long before he was killed. One can only hope that he found real hope at the end.
Would you join me as we pray? Dear God, our Father, we bring before you today students at SMBC who are graduating, finishing off their studies at the college, including those who have studied part-time. We thank you for the blessing that their time of study has been. We thank you for the knowledge that they've gained through your word and through reflecting on what that means for Christian life and service in your world. We thank you for the wisdom they've gained and for their growth in Christian maturity and in knowing how to convey the gospel and show love to all kinds of people in this varied world. Thank you so much for all the encouragement in their faith that they've given and been given during their time at college. We pray for them now as they leave the college and enter the wider world to live as your people and to serve others. Please keep them strong in their faith, godly in their lives, and joyful in your service. Grant that they would be a blessing to those around them and find a blessing in Christian life and service. Please use them wherever they are and in whatever capacity they serve you, so that their lives and service may bring honour to the gospel of Christ and glory to you and salvation to other people. Please protect them, guide them, strengthen them by your Spirit to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, as the light of the gospel shines through them to the people around them. For Jesus' sake we pray.
We're now going to read God's word together. So turn to Genesis 23. Genesis 23, starting at verse 1. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of this field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, Listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. to Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field were deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave were in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site.
When I was growing up, every second Christmas holidays, our family would pile into the hold in Kingswood, and we'd do a big drive across the country from Armidale, northern New South Wales, where we lived, across to Perth, where my parents came from and where all our relatives were. Now, when our family was all in the car, my dad had this habit of telling stories to match the places that we were driving through. And it wouldn't matter if we'd heard the story before. If ever we drove through that particular part of the country or past a landmark, Dad would tell the story that matched. Now, if you make the pilgrimage to Perth, as we did every second year, there's a point when you go through the West Australian goldfields where there's a big pipeline along the side of the road. Every time we drove past that pipeline, my dad would tell the story of Charles O'Connor. See, Charles O'Connor was an engineer, and back in the 1880s, there was gold rushes out in the dry, barren desert centre of WA. And with those gold rushes came this population explosion. And with the population explosion came this problem. How are we going to get water out into the desert centre where there's all these people now living? Well, Charles O'Connor was the man who was commissioned to design and build a pipeline from Perth all the way to Kalgoorlie. It was a massive project. It cost £2.5 million, which was a lot of money back then. And it involved laying down pipes which are almost 1 metre in diameter for over 500 kilometres. So it took years and years to build. Now, over those years, Charles O'Connor copped a lot of flack. People said it was an impossible project. People said it would never work. People said they were wasting money. People said it was taking too long. And over time, all of this criticism took its toll on Charles O'Connor. Eventually, he started to believe the doubters, and he gave up hope that the pipeline would ever work. And one day he rode his horse in despair. He rode his horse into the sea. And when the horse refused to keep going, Charles O'Connor shot himself. Now, it didn't matter how many times my dad told that story, I was always gripped as he told that story. And I can still remember sitting in the hold in Kingswood, driving past the pipelines through the desert, and just feeling so sad for this man who had lost hope, who had died in despair, who'd abandoned his dream. What do you do when it seems that the thing that you've put your hope into is never going to materialise? What do you do when the thing that you've been pouring your life into seems to have led to nothing? Well, for some of you here today, or watching on the live stream, today is your last Principles Hour. You're about to graduate. You're about to go out from SMBC to pour your lives into a dream of serving Jesus, of telling the gospel, of making disciples. What if in 1 year's time, or 5 years' time, or 20 years' time, what if you find yourself in a place where it seems like your dream is not becoming a reality? The thing that you're pouring your life into looks like it's not going to materialise. People are not responding to the gospel, the ministry doesn't seem to be going forward. What then? Well, in our story today, Abraham could easily be forgiven for feeling like this. See, it's now 62 years since God told him to leave his land and his family and his father's household and go to this place that God promised to give him. 62 years. Abraham's been waiting for God to give him this land. 62 years Abraham's been living as a foreigner and a stranger in a foreign land. And after 62 years of waiting, Abraham still doesn't own a single square metre of this promised land. He's put his wife through so much loss and danger and risk. Both of them have poured their whole life into this promise. They've put all their hopes into this promise. But now Sarah's died. She didn't live to see the land become theirs. She's died waiting. Her time is up. And so the question in this passage that we confront as we read of her death is, what's Abraham going to do about that? Like, surely it must be tempting for him just to give up on the promise, go back to his homeland in Ur and bury Sarah there. Surely he's given it a good enough go. I mean, his 127-year-old wife has just died waiting for that promise to come true. What's Abraham going to do? Well, whatever he does, you and I need to watch carefully and learn. Because we saw last week, didn't we, in Genesis chapter 22, that after years in the school of faith, Abraham passed the end of semester exam. So the quality, the maturity of this man's faith has now been proven. So what does a mature, proven faith do in a situation like this? What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems like God's promises have failed? That's a question that we're going to bring to the text today. What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems that the promises have failed? So let's turn to Genesis chapter 23 and find out the answer. Genesis chapter 23. In the first two verses, the death of Sarah is recorded. Have a look at those verses. So Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Sarah has died. Abraham mourns, Abraham weeps. And an important detail in these first couple of verses is the location where Sarah dies. It says that she dies in the land of Canaan. This is the land that God, way back in Genesis 12, God told Abraham and Sarah to go to, that he promised to give to them. But what becomes apparent in the next verse, verse 3, is God still hasn't come good on this promise. Verse 3, Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and he spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. So it's the Hittites, which are the local Canaanites. They're the local landowners. Abraham, a foreigner and stranger. And as a foreigner and stranger, he doesn't own any property. Do you think this is what Abraham imagined 62 years earlier when God told him to go and promised him this land? That he would go, that he would take his wife. 62 years later, his wife would die of old age. And not only would they not own all that land that was promised, they wouldn't even own enough to bury his wife. Do you think that's how he imagined it? Do you think he's having doubts now? Has what they lived for come to nothing? Has he uprooted his family for a pipe dream? Well, as we keep reading in this text, we discover that the answer is no. Abraham is not abandoning the dream. In fact, in the verse that we just read, in verse 4, we see an important clue as to what he's doing. He says, sell me some property. Sell me some property. And the word that's translated here as property is actually a really significant word for the author of Genesis. Back in chapter 17, verse 8, that we looked at a few weeks back, God had used that same word when he made the land promise to Abraham. Have a listen to what God said in chapter 17, verse 8. God said, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. Now, the word for possession there is the same Hebrew word that Abraham's just used when he said, sell me some property. Sell me a possession is what he's saying. You see, Abraham is pursuing the promise, possession of the promised land. And he wants this possession so he can bury his wife there. See, for Abraham, for people of Abraham's era, where you bury your family is really important. It reflects where your home is. It reflects where you belong. It reflects where you think you and your family's future lies. And for Abraham, that is the land of promise, the promised land. Now, depending on your own cultural background, what happens next you might find strange, even comical. So the Hittites say, here, have this land. And Abraham says, no, I want to pay for it. And the Hittites say, no, just take it. And back and forth it goes. And you might think, what's the big deal here? If you're not aware of the cultural subtleties that are going on, if you're not aware of what's at stake in this little negotiation, you might just think, come on, Abraham, just take their offer and bury your wife. Because for many of us, I think that reading this text here can be a bit like a cross-cultural experience. You know, those cross-cultural experiences where you don't understand the rules of communication and you miss the point. I remember when we first moved to Southeast Asia, we had a visit from a man. He came to our house, came in for a cup of tea, and it turned out in conversation that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in our house before we moved in. We had this nice conversation and off he went. But a week later, he turned up again, came in for another cup of tea and told me the same story, that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in the house before us. And I thought, yeah, you told me that last week. Anyway, we had a nice time and he left. A week later, he comes again. Comes in for a cup of tea, sits down, and he tells me the story of the fact that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in the house before us. So by this stage, I knew something was going on. I'm not that slow. So I went and I asked my cultural informant, what's going on? Why does this man keep telling me the same story? And the culture informant said, in our culture, telling stories is a way that we make requests. He's asking you if you will employ him as your gardener. And I said, oh, okay, I see. Okay, I'll go and tell him, no, I don't need a gardener. I said, no, don't do that. Just tell some story that shows that you don't need the gardener. When we read this interchange here between Abraham and the Hittites, we might be a bit like me in that conversation with the would-be gardener. We might be missing the point unless we understand what's going on. So let's have a look now and see what that point is. So Abraham has said in verse 4, sell me a possession. The Hittites' response is in verse 5. Have a look at that. The Hittites replied to Abraham, sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Now, this seems like a generous and polite offer, but actually it's a refusal of what Abraham's asked for. Abraham wants to own the land, but the Hittites at this stage seem reluctant to let their land go to a foreigner. So what they say is, look, just use one of our tombs. But if Abraham accepts that offer, sure, he can bury Sarah there, but the land would remain Hittite land. And so the promise would not advance. Abraham is pursuing the promise that he would possess this land. And so this offer is not acceptable to Abraham. So in verse 7, have a read. Verse 7, it says, Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. I don't know about you, but in my family, if I'm refusing an offer from someone, I'm saying no deal. I don't usually start by bowing down before them, but that's the polite negotiating practice that Abraham uses here. So he bows down, verse 7, and then verse 8, he said to them, if you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. See, Abraham wants possession. He wants ownership. Abraham is pursuing the promise. He's already picked out a cave and he's willing to pay full price for it. So you see what's going on here? It's a tug of war between the Hittites and Abraham. It's a very polite tug of war, but it's a tug of war nonetheless. Let's keep going and see how the Hittites respond. In verse 10 it says, Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. So Ephron, the cave owner, just happens to be there. And we discover in this verse here, these verses here, that all of this is taking place at the gate of the city. This is the legal centre of town. So whatever happens here in this negotiation, it's going to be legit. It's going to be legal. It's going to be binding. And so Ephron, the cave owner, actually makes a play at this point. I don't know if you noticed that. Abraham had asked for the cave. He throws in a field as well. Once again, this seems really generous, but as we'll see in a moment, it's a clever tactical move to make himself richer. But for now, notice that he uses the word give. I'll give you the land. I'll give it to you. This may well just be a polite cultural habit of courtesy. It may not be a genuine offer to just give the land. But regardless of whether it's genuine or not, Abraham cannot accept this offer. Because if everyone does give it, then the land wouldn't officially be deeded over to Abraham. It wouldn't be a formal transfer of possession. And Abraham is pursuing the promise. Abraham wants possession. So, once again, very politely, Abraham says, no deal. Verse 12. Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Once again, notice that all this is happening in their hearing. It's happening in the presence of witnesses. Whatever's going to happen here, it can't be disputed. It can't be contested. It's going to be legal and binding. So Abraham's response is clear, right? I will pay. I won't accept the gift. I will pay. I'll pay the full price. There must be no doubt that this land is coming into my possession. Abraham is pursuing the promise. In verse 14, we have Ephron's response to that. Verse 14, Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. I love what Ephron does here. He just drops in a figure. No big deal, Abraham. Like I said, I'm happy to give it to you, but if you must know, it's worth 400 shekels. And 400 shekels is probably about 10 times what the field is actually worth. So this is an absolutely exorbitant request from Ephron. So what's Abraham going to do? Ephron's asked a whole lot more than the land should be worth. But when Ephron makes this, when he says the land is worth, he uses the Hebrew word eretz. This is a really significant word for Israel and for Abraham. It's the word that God used back in chapter 12 when he said, I will give you this land. And for subsequent generations of Israelites, that word came to mean the promised land. And so unknowingly, Ephron, when he said what the land is worth, he's just reminded Abraham, this land, this is the land of promise, the land God has promised you. And as we know, Abraham is pursuing the promise. So what does Abraham do? Verse 16, Abraham agreed to Ephron's exorbitant terms, and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. In the presence of witnesses, Abraham pays. He doesn't haggle. He just counts out the silver. See, there must be no doubt whatsoever about this. There must be no chance for someone in the future to say, Abraham didn't pay full price. He haggled it down. So this is not really coming into his possession. So what Abraham does is he pays Ephron's exorbitant price. What's the outcome of all of this? Verse 17 reads like a legal contract. Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. The outcome is that Abraham owns a portion of the promised land. Formally, legally, indisputably, Abraham owns it. And so verse 20, the narrator concludes this story with, so the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. And the Hebrew word underlying that final phrase there, in burial site, includes that word for possession. The same word that God had used when he promised the land back in chapter 15. Came to Abraham as his possession. So you see the significance of what's just happened here in this negotiation. The background is that God had promised a possession, and what Abraham has done here is Abraham has pursued that promise. Even when it seemed like God wasn't coming good on his promise, Abraham has pursued that promise. And now, in a very small way, this promise is beginning to be fulfilled. A small parcel of the promised land, almost like a deposit guaranteeing what is going to come, a small parcel has passed into Abraham's possession. So let's return to our question. What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems that the promises have failed? The answer is that faith pursues the promise. Faith doggedly, perseveringly pursues the promise. Faith lives for that promise, even when doing so seems like folly. Faith lives for that day when the promises will be fulfilled. Faith accepts that pursuing the promise might be costly. Faith is ready to count out the shekels. Faith is patient. Faith waits, even when we don't see as much of the promise fulfillment as we'd hoped, as we'd like. What does faith look like? Faith pursues the promise. Even when sight screams out, no, don't do that, do something else. This promise is going nowhere. This promise is never going to be fulfilled. So at the end of this narrative, in verse 19, Abraham buries Sarah in the promised land, and we need to see that this is an act of faith. It's faith that one day God will give the whole land to his people. Well, 2 chapters later, in chapter 25, Abraham himself breathes his last. Have a look at that, chapter 25, verses 9 and 10. Where is Abraham buried? Chapter 25, verse 9. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the fields of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought for the Hittites. So a pattern is being established here. First Sarah, now Abraham, buried in that cave. The pattern is that God's people are living for the promise. They're not living for the now. They're not living for what they can just see and what they can touch. They're living for that promise. They're dying, waiting for that promise. They're dying, not giving up on the promise. They're living and dying in the hope that one day God will come good on his promise and give this land to his people, even if that day comes after their own death. See, a pattern is being established. Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow. And follow they do. Abraham and Sarah's son, Isaac, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, they also get buried in that cave. What about their grandson, Jacob? He dies a long way from that cave in Egypt. But have a listen to his dying words. Turn right to the back of Genesis. Genesis 49, verse 29. Jacob's dying words from Egypt. Genesis 49:29, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. See, Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow, and they are following. They are being buried in that cave. They are living for that promise. They're dying, waiting for that promise. They're trusting that one day God will come good on his promise and do what he's promised to do, that he'll give the whole land to his people. God's people are living for that future day, even if it ends up coming after their own death. What about Abraham and Sarah's great-grandson, Joseph? Well, he too dies a long way from that cave. He too dies in Egypt. And have a listen to his dying words. Now, these dying words are the climax of the book of Genesis, the closing section of the whole book. Chapter 50, verse 24. Verse 24, he says, I am about to die. And then in verse 25, God will surely come to your aid. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. Don't bury me here in Egypt. God will deliver you back to the promised land. And when he does that, take my bones with you. See, Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow, and they are following. They're living for the promise. They're making a statement in their death, identifying with people of the promise, being laid to rest in the promised land out of a confidence that one day God will fulfill the promise. God will carry out his great missional plan. He will give the land to his people. Abraham and Sarah laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow. And that includes you and me. You see, we, God's people, we are still waiting for God's promises to Abraham to be fully and finally fulfilled. We're still waiting for that moment when people from every nation will enjoy blessing in the land, in the place that God is preparing. Yes, the promise was partially fulfilled in the days of Joshua, but the full blessing to all peoples didn't happen then. And in the New Testament, we discover that that land, that place, is actually the new creation, the heavenly homeland. And we discover that that moment will be the moment when Jesus returns. And so you and I, we're still waiting for that moment. And if that's what we're doing now, if we're waiting for that moment, then we need to learn to follow the pattern that Abraham and Sarah laid out for us. Living for the promise. Dying, waiting for the promise, pursuing the promise, pouring our lives, pouring our shekels, pouring our everything into that promise out of a confidence that one day God will fulfill it. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews is talking about in that famous chapter, chapter 11, that famous chapter about faith. Have a look at Hebrews 11, first couple of verses. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients, like Abraham and Sarah, were commended for. See, buying a field in the promised land, that's confidence in what we hope for. Burying your wife in the promised land, that's assurance about what we do not see. Assurance that one day God would come good on his promise. That's faith. That's the pattern you and I are to follow. In verse 9 of Hebrews 11, he writes, by faith, he, that is Abraham, made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. As we look back on Abraham's life and we ask, how could he do all of that? How could he live as a foreigner and a stranger in a foreign land? The answer is here. He was living for the promise. He was looking forward to that city that God would build. Verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Abraham and Sarah didn't receive what was promised. They died waiting for the full fulfillment. They lived their lives in hope, in faith, waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. And that is the pattern that you and I are to follow. See, just like Abraham and Sarah, we're waiting for the heavenly fulfillment of that promise. We're longing for a better heavenly country. And we wait, as we wait, we too live for the promise. We live pursuing the promise. We live for that moment that may well come after we've died, when Jesus returns and the promises to Abraham are completely fulfilled. Right now, we're pouring our lives into that moment, putting our hope in that moment. And living that way is very different to living by sight. See, living that way is not going to make sense to people around you who don't know the promise. Just imagine someone who didn't know the promise to Abraham, watching the negotiations between Abraham and Ephron. He might have jumped in and said, no, Abraham, don't do that. Don't waste 400 shekels on that. The land's not worth that. Don't waste all that money. Living for the promise won't make sense for people around us who don't know the promise. Some of you are finishing up at SMBC this year. You're heading off into a life of serving Jesus. As you pour yourself into evangelism, into discipleship, into church planting, Bible study leading, praying, caring for people, as you pour yourselves into those things, there might be people around you who want to jump in and say, no, don't do that. Don't waste your life on that. Don't do that. You might be tempted to live for something else, something more tangible, something you can see. It's going to be especially hard if you're not seeing the progress in your ministry that you hope to be seeing, if it feels like your ministry dream is not becoming a reality. What will you do then? Well, Abraham and Sarah have laid down a pattern for us to follow. Pursue the promise. Whether we're seeing God's promises go forward in our personal ministry or not, we pursue the promise. Charles O'Connor stopped believing that his dream of the pipeline would become a reality, and he took his own life in despair. After he died, they completed the pipeline, and contrary to everyone's expectations, it worked, and the goldfields were watered. Sometimes when our dad told us that story, we'd stop at a rest area and we'd drink water from the Charles O'Connor pipelines. And I remember sitting there thinking, if only Charles O'Connor could see me now drinking this water. If only he could see me now when he was having those moments of despair and when he gave up on his dream. That would have got him through those moments. Abraham spent his life waiting for the promise. And yet when he died, what did he have to show for it? He'd been promised descendants like the grains of sand on the seashore, and he had Isaac. He'd been promised this massive land, and he had a tiny portion of the land which he'd had to pay an exorbitant price for. That was the extent of the great nation, the people of God, that he'd been promised. But if he could see us now, around the globe today, hundreds of millions of believers from hundreds of tribes and nations and peoples, If he could see us now. There may be times in the future for us when it seems like our time is up and the promises are failing. If only we could see that day now, that day when Jesus returns. If only we could see that now, that'd get us through, wouldn't it? Well, with the eyes of faith, we can see that day. And we need to fix our eyes on it. Let's live for that day. Let's pursue that promise. Let's pray. Dear God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God who is preparing a heavenly homeland for us, your people, God who is going to send Jesus for a second time to bring all of your promises to Abraham to fulfillment, we thank you. We thank you for your promises. And we ask you to help us hold on to them, whether we're seeing them fulfilled in front of our eyes or whether we're just waiting. Help us to hold on to your promises. Help us to pursue the promise. And help us to see with eyes of faith that day when Jesus returns and to live for that day, to organise our whole lives around the reality that that day is coming. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Brothers and sisters, let's pursue the promise. Brothers and sisters who are finishing up with us this year, God bless you, and may God bless many people through you. If you're on campus, please join us now for morning tea.